June 3, 1943, 4:46 a.m. Liberty Shipyard, Richmond, California. Cold fog clung to the docks as sparks rained from a dozen welding torches, lighting the shipyard like a forest of steel fireworks. The clang of hammers echoed through the early morning gloom, mixing with the low rumble of cranes shifting massive metal plates into position. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and salt drifting in from the bay. The workers moved with a rhythm that felt almost military, swift, precise, tireless. A guarded truck rolled to a stop beside Dock 5. German POWs stepped out one by one, boots clacking against concrete. Among them was Sergeant Karl Reiner, a U-boat veteran who had seen shipyards across the Reich. But nothing he had ever witnessed prepared him for this. Before him rose the half-built hull of a Liberty ship, enormous, skeletal, alive with sparks and steam. Hundreds of workers swarmed over it, welding seams, aligning beams, guiding cranes with nothing more than hand signals. Karl stared, stunned. "Das ist nicht möglich," he whispered. Private Gunther Engel, barely in his 20s, squinted at the chaos. "They cannot build ships this fast," he said, sounding more like he was trying to convince himself. An American foreman, sleeves rolled up and voice booming, shouted across the yard, "Let's move. We're already ahead. Keep that pace." "Ahead?" Karl frowned. "Ahead of what?" A Marine guard standing nearby answered casually. "Ahead of finishing the ship. For days, maybe 5. Karl laughed out loud, short, sharp, mocking. "A ship? In 4 days? That is insanity." But the guard didn't laugh back. The Germans watched, speechless, as a crane lifted an entire prefabricated stern section, an enormous slab of steel, and swung it across the yard as if it weighed nothing. Workers guided it into place with ropes, shouting quick instructions. 10 seconds later, the stern locked perfectly against the hull with a deep metallic thud. 10 seconds. Gunther grabbed Karl's sleeve, eyes wide. "They built that whole section somewhere else, and just brought it here to attach." Karl nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Back in Germany, shipyards shaped vessels piece by delicate piece. But these Americans, they were assembling ships like machines, modular, fast, brutal in efficiency. Another whistle blared. A massive midsection rolled down the rails, already complete, already welded, already painted on the inside. Workers cheered as it slid into alignment with the rest of the hull, as if they'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Karl felt a chill creep through him. "This," he murmured, "is how they win wars." But he still hadn't seen the moment that would shatter his pride completely. A foreman climbed onto a crate and shouted, "Clear the dock. The bow section is ready for lift." Every head turned. Even the Marines straightened. Something enormous was about to rise. Something that would make every German POW understand the truth America had kept hidden behind its factories and fog. A deep, metallic horn rolled across the shipyard, vibrating through concrete and bone. Workers stepped back from their stations, Marines shifted their rifles, and the German POWs instinctively formed a line along the railing overlooking Dock 5. Even the cranes stopped moving, their steel arms frozen midair like giants pausing to watch history being made. Fog drifted low across the yard as a team of American welders pulled the tarp off a massive structure beside the dock. The Germans leaned forward, expecting to see some small piece of the ship, maybe a bulkhead or a cargo frame. But the moment the tarp fell, several of them gasped aloud. It wasn't a piece. It was the entire bow, a towering steel section taller than a house, wide as a city street, already welded, shaped, braced, and finished. Fresh weld lines glowed faintly like veins pulsing through metal. The steel still radiated warmth from overnight work. Gunther grabbed the railing. "Karl, they built that in how long?" Karl didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the board beside the bow, painted in bold black letters. Start time, June 1 to 6 a.m. Completion, June 3 to 4:20 a.m. Less than 48 hours. For the entire bow of a cargo ship. A German POW behind them whispered, stunned, "This is not industry. This is sorcery." The Marine guard smirked. "No sorcery. Just American workers and no damn excuses." Before the Germans could process it, the giant crane hook swung downward. Workers secured steel cables through the lifting rings, some climbing the bow as casually as stepping up a ladder. A tugboat horn blared across the docks. A foreman waved his helmet in a wide arc and shouted, "Lift it!" The crane engines roared. The cables tightened. The bow shuddered, then rose into the sky. The German POWs flinched backward in shock as the enormous steel wall ascended above them, swinging gently as workers on the ground guided it with ropes, shouting directions over the whining motors. Floodlights reflected off the metal as it climbed higher, higher, until it towered above the half-built hull like a steel cliff suspended in midair. Carl felt sweat bead on his forehead. Got him, Himmel. The bow drifted slowly across the dock, rotating with perfect control, aligning with the waiting midsection like the last piece of a colossal puzzle. And then, so smoothly it looked rehearsed, it descended into place. A deep, resonant clang echoed across the harbor as the edges met perfectly, as if the two pieces had been born together. Workers swarmed instantly, sparks flying as welders fused the plates, riveters hammering with mechanical fury. Gunther's voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Carl, if they can build ships like this, how many can they make in a year?" Carl swallowed hard, eyes never leaving the bow now locked into place. "Enough," he said, his voice hollow. "Enough to drown the Kriegsmarine in steel." But the Americans weren't finished. A siren sounded again, short, sharp, urgent. Reporters rushed forward. Shipyard workers wiped their hands on their overalls. Marines straightened their belts. Something else was about to be revealed. Something even more unbelievable than the bow's lift. The foreman stepped onto a stack of crates and raised a megaphone. "Everybody stay where you are. We're announcing the launch date." The Germans stiffened, breath held. And when the foreman shouted the date, several POWs went pale. Because the Americans weren't planning to launch the ship next week. Or in a month. They planned to launch it tomorrow. A stunned silence swept through the German POW line as the foreman's words echoed across the fog-soaked shipyard. "Launch is tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. The word hung in the air like a hammer blow. Gunther shook his head violently, as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. "Neen, that cannot be. A ship cannot be ready to sail in 3 days." His voice cracked. "It is impossible." But everything the Germans were seeing told them the opposite. By midday, the yard roared with energy. Sparks burst from the hull like fireworks as teams of welders sealed the seams between the bow, midsection, and stern. Pipes were lowered into place by swinging cranes, disappearing into open decks like massive arteries being fed into a living beast. Electricians rushed along catwalks stringing cables. Painters rolled fresh gray paint across the hull while it was still warm from welding. Carl stared upward as a cluster of young women, Rosies, guided an entire prefabricated engine compartment down a steel ramp. They laughed as they worked, sleeves rolled up, hair tied in bandanas. It didn't matter that the steel weighed tons. They moved with the same confidence as factory workers assembling radios or refrigerators. "They build ships as casually as we build cars," Carl muttered, voice unsteady. A POW beside him whispered, "No. Faster." Above them, a group of workers lowered the ship's funnel into place while the deck teams hammered in ventilation grates. Forklifts carried crates of plumbing, electrical panels, mattresses, and cabin doors. Everything labeled, pre-cut, pre-measured. Nothing needed shaping. Nothing needed improvisation. Everything was ready. Everything fit. German shipyards, Carl knew, still handcrafted their vessels section by section. Slow, meticulous, aircraft carrier perfection. But the Americans had thrown that philosophy into the fire. They had turned shipbuilding into an assembly line. Not delicate, but unstoppable. And then the moment came that shattered the last illusions. A supervisor shouted, "Bring in the engine." The Germans stiffened. 2 massive cranes rolled down the rails, pulling behind them a fully assembled triple-expansion steam engine. Polished, tested, gleaming. Dozens of workers guided the towering machinery with ropes as it crept toward the waiting ship. Steam curled from the pipes as if the engine itself were breathing. Carl felt the blood drain from his face. "Das ist fertig," he whispered. "It's already finished." The engine, built off-site, tested off-site, delivered ready to run, rose into the air on steel cables. The massive block of iron and pistons swung over the hull, descending into the engine room opening with surgeon-like precision. In Germany, it would take months to build the engine alone. Here, it clicked into place in minutes. Screws tightened. Bolts hammered. Steam hissed. Workers cheered. Gunther's voice trembled. "Carl, this ship will sail. It will truly sail tomorrow." Carl didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes followed the hull from bow to stern. Where yesterday had been scattered steel plates and scaffolding, now stood a completed vessel, painted, welded, plumbed, wired, and armed with cranes, winches, and ready cargo bays. A Liberty ship, built in 3 days. A POW beside him whispered bitterly, "So this is why they win. They can replace everything we destroy." Carl slowly nodded. "This is not just a ship," he murmured. "This is a message." The shipyard horn blared again, deep, powerful, final. Workers stepped back from the decking. Foremen checked the last bolts. Painters finished the ship's name in white letters. A band began warming their instruments near the christening platform. The Liberty ship, 1056, was ready. And the Germans realized with a cold, crushing certainty that they were witnessing something far more devastating than bombs or bullets. They were witnessing the speed of a nation that refused to lose. The next morning dawned with a pale, almost ghostly fog rolling in from the bay. The Liberty ship stood fully finished at the edge of the slipway, its fresh gray paint still smelling of solvent, its deck rails gleaming under the dim sunlight. Workers in hard hats and overalls crowded the dockside. Reporters climbed scaffolds for a better angle. Sailors from the nearby naval station lined the pier, caps tucked under their arms. Even the German POWs were positioned close, guarded but unblocked, because the Americans wanted them to see this. The band struck the first notes of a triumphant march. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A woman in welding leathers, sparks still clinging to her gloves, stepped forward with a champagne bottle in her hand. She wasn't some dignitary. She wasn't a politician. She was one of the welders who had built the ship with her own hands. Carl felt a strange, uneasy tension coil in his chest. The woman raised the bottle, shouted the name of the ship, and smashed it against the bow. Glass and champagne burst across the steel. The crowd roared. A klaxon blared. Dock crews shouted orders. Tugboats revved their engines. And then the massive wooden blocks beneath the hull were kicked free. The ship shifted. The Germans leaned forward instinctively. Gunther gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. The Liberty ship began to slide. First slowly, groaning as gravity found its purchase. Then faster, smooth, unstoppable, skidding down the greased slipway toward the water. Workers cheered, waving their helmets. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders shouted with joy. Reporters snapped photographs faster than their cameras could process. The ship hit the water with a colossal splash that sent white foam towering into the air like a wave crashing against a cliff. Tugboats surged into position, catching the newborn vessel before it drifted too far. Carl watched in stunned, frozen silence. In Germany, ships launched after months of painstaking labor, long ceremonies celebrating craftsmanship and national pride. Here the Americans launched one as casually as rolling a new car off the factory line. And yet the reaction was anything but casual. This wasn't just a ship launch. This was a statement. A foreman climbed onto a crate, raising his megaphone over the thunder of applause. "All right, you hard-working heroes," he bellowed. "We launch another Liberty next week. Maybe sooner if you animals keep this pace." Laughter erupted across the dock. Pride shone on every American face. The German POWs, however, stood motionless, almost breathless. Gunther wiped a hand down his face, voice shaky. "Carl, we sank so many merchant ships. Hundreds, thousands of tons. All that effort." He gestured helplessly at the gleaming Liberty ship floating proudly in the harbor. "And they replaced them in days." Carl didn't answer for a long moment. His eyes followed the ship as tugboats pulled it toward deeper water. American crewmen were already climbing aboard, checking valves, inspecting winches, preparing the vessel for immediate outfitting. Finally, Carl said quietly, "We never understood the truth." Gunther frowned. "What truth?" Carl exhaled, the fog swirling around his breath. "We thought we were fighting their navy, their convoys, their escorts." He shook his head slowly. "But what we were really fighting," he pointed at the shipyard, at the sparks, the cranes, the endless rows of prefabricated steel, "was this. American industry, American speed, American scale, a force no U-boat, no Luftwaffe bomber, no strategy could ever defeat. The Liberty ship, born in 72 hours, drifted toward the horizon, a silent steel message carried on the morning tide. And every German POW watching knew, in that moment, that the war's outcome had already been written. Not on the battlefield, not in the Atlantic, but here, in a fog-covered California shipyard, where America built ships faster than Germany could sink them.